know that fiction is truer than history because it goes beyond the evidence. I've thought about that a lot this pandemic spring. We all know that fiction is truer than history because it goes beyond the evidence. The Red Lotus had its origins in April of 2018. I read an article in the New York Times about how New York City rodents carry 8 different kinds of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Among the people quoted in the article was Peter Daszak, an epidemiologist, and you might have seen him on 60 Minutes 2 weeks ago. So I called him up out of intellectual curiosity, wasn't sure what I wanted to talk to him about, but I knew it had something to do with, well, rats. And he said this, he's one of the smartest guys I've ever interviewed for a book. When the next pandemic arrives, it's going to hit New York City hard, because New York City has the 3 criteria you need for a pandemic: high population density, mass transportation, and international travelers coming and going. And I was often running on a novel about a New York City ER doctor who goes on a bike tour of Vietnam with her new boyfriend, and he disappears. And in his absence, she discovers that so much that he told her was a lie, and she is in spectacular amounts of danger from, among other things, a deadly pathogen. So I'm just going to read you the first page of the novel, and then we can talk about how we're staying sane and how calories don't count in a pandemic, especially if they come from a Pop-Tart. This is the opening of the Red Lotus. The opposite of a hospice, not a maternity ward or a NICU, it's a trick question. The correct answer, an emergency room. In a hospice, you do everything you can to allow people to die. In the ER, you do all that you can to keep them alive. It was why she loved the ER, especially the night shift in the city. The relentlessness, the frenetic drive to keep a heart beating or to get someone breathing. Oh, sometimes you lost, you called it. You declared the suicide or the stroke victim or the accidental overdose dead, but far more often, you won. Or at least, you won long enough to get the patient into the OR or into a room upstairs. You won long enough that whatever happened to the man or woman or child or toddler or, dear God, baby, was someone else's problem. And so she became a different person in the ER. She had, in fact, become a different person there. She was a tectonic recreation that was unrecognizable even to her own mother. An evolution wrought in months rather than millennia, 66 months, if she's going to be precise, that had begun in her first rotation and culminated during her first July night as an attending physician. It was in the midst of the ER madness, the light and the sound, and there were just so many sounds, the human and the mechanical, the dying and the wounded and the supportive and the scared, that she morphed into an adrenaline junkie. She was no longer a shy soul that balked at attention, a girl as wary of kindness as shelter cats with torn ears that, even after adopted, would shrink into the dark of the closet. She was something bigger, inexorable, and unyielding. Thank you.
That's lovely. I think this is where I kind of say hi and maybe get to get a conversation going about what you're writing. What I should explain to people is that there is a very specific reason that I have not read the book yet, which is that was the only way I would be allowed to do this event. So I'm a judge this year for the National Book Award in fiction. And because of that, I'm not really supposed to say yes to, certainly not to reviewing things, to blurbing things, or to doing events, because it could look like I'm supporting one thing over the other. But we decided that if this conversation, at least between the two of us, this part of it is more about writing and survival and all that, and then that I read the book later, no one can accuse me of anything. So that's our story, and that's what we're going with. But can I ask you a question, which is, I mean, certainly the angle of how topical this would be probably never was never on your mind, I'm sure. At what point did you realize that this would maybe be read in a different way than you were thinking about it when you wrote it? Was this, you know, is this while the book's coming out? Is this like in the weeks leading up to publication? What was happening?
Red Lotus was published on March 17th, that Tuesday, literally the week that we were all beginning to social distance, we were beginning to quarantine. We're no longer just social distancing. Literally, we were closing down. The bookstore were closing down. I mean, I've got the most lovely notes from booksellers apologizing that, you know, we never even unpacked it and we never opened our doors. And I've had some pretty weird publication dates in my life. I had a book published literally on Tuesday, 9/11. I had a book published the Tuesday after the Boston Marathon bombing. I had a book published 2 days before we invaded Iraq. Now, I don't say
maybe
that.
You should stop publishing books. Please don't stop.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't want to give you the impression you should never get on an airplane with me and I'm jinxed, because the point of that is that I'm not. I mean, I've had 35 publication dates, counting the paperbacks, and 31 were fine. 31 were a dream, 4 not so much. And that's what I mean about the tides of history. We're always living in history, and sometimes we're just oblivious to that, and sometimes we feel it acutely. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that I am the dullest bulb in the tanning bed, but I just might be. Throughout January and February, as we watched the spread of COVID-19, first out of Wuhan and then into Europe, I thought it is obviously going to reach North America, but I also never anticipated that by June 2nd, at least 102,000 people would be dead with quarantining, with social distancing. I never anticipated that horrific, devastating, cataclysmic effect. Secondly, okay, so the book published March 17th. Beginning the first week in March, and my friends at the Northshire, and actually I had a number of conversations about this, we started talking about how do we make a book tour work and so that people feel comfortable. One of the things about the Northshire in Manchester is it's a great place to read, but you know, we pack 150 people into that very specific part of the store. It's not an off-site event, it's an on-site event. You're in the store, which is great, so you can talk about books and you're around books, but you're shoulder to shoulder. It's a regional jet kind of claustrophobia. So we were already trying to figure out, how do we make people feel comfortable? How do we pre-sign books? How do we not have a signing line? How do we not have a selfie line? And we were having those discussions, but it wasn't until Friday, March 13th, 4 days before the pub date, that we canceled the book tour. And then it just happened with lightning speed. I mean, I was supposed to sign stock at the Vermont stores on Tuesday and Wednesday. And even then they were only doing curbside pickup. And so it was just already a very different, changed world. And I wish I could say I was so smart and saw it coming, but I didn't.
But at the same time, your imagination was working on that topic. There was something that you were tapping into, right? There's a sense, maybe, I think, when writers really hit it, there's some tapping into some zeitgeist, some kind of tapping into history, and then being right about it. That, whether that's supernatural or just like our job, I don't know, or both.
Yeah, you're definitely onto something. I mean, books work sometimes because they're in the zeitgeist, and sometimes they work because they allow us to escape from the zeitgeist. And then there are those moments of historical fiction where you think you're escaping the zeitgeist, and they are spectacularly, eerily, horrifically timely.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think there are moments like that. If I were to pick up The Great Believers right now, I'm sure okay, here's one moment that I can tell you right now. There are some scenes in The Great Believers that I had completely forgotten about historically until I was reading the passages about how awful, despicable Ronald Reagan was when it came to this epidemic and how he was handling it in the 1980s. And when I thought about that on my bike the other day, it immediately brought back my feelings about how spectacularly the current administration, how heartlessly the current administration is handling a pandemic.
Yeah. It's been really interesting. For me, The Great Believers has been out for almost 2 years. So 2 years ago in hardcover, last year in paperback. And, as much as I was hoping it would continue to sell, I wasn't anticipating doing interviews right now. And I had this whole new round in the past few weeks of interest from the press, radio, and newspapers, people wanting to talk about parallels, contrasts, hope, and it's always my job to make sure that things aren't getting oversimplified. It's compare and contrast, like we all learned to do in high school. It's not, wow, these are the same, or no, they're completely different. There are some eerie similarities. There are some vast differences, and, in different realms, political, medical, sociological, historical, etc. But one of the things that's kind of blown my mind with my book is the number of people who had read, they're tweeting at me or they're Instagramming this or whatever, saying, well, I read it last year and I really liked it, but I didn't really get it until we started going through our own pandemic, which I kind of feel like that's a little odd. They didn't get, but whatever. But they're relating maybe to subject matter, older crises, narratives, whatever, in a different way now. Whatever gets the job done, man.
Okay. The Great Believers is set in 1985, and I don't view that as historical fiction because, I was in my early 20s. I was so cognizant of the AIDS epidemic. I was living in New York City. I was so cognizant of the AIDS epidemic. But if you're born in, say, 1997, and you're 23 years old, and you're reading The Great Believers, and you're turning the page, because the thing about The Great Believers is it's not just wrenchingly beautiful. I mean, it is a page turners. You're moving back and forth in time between Paris and the present. And is that historical fiction, 1985 AIDS epidemic, or is it as contemporary as a book about COVID-19? And I think it's a really interesting discussion to have.
Well, there's this sense in which basically as soon as we write anything, it's historical fiction. If we were writing about the real world, right? People are, I know, a lot of writer friends right now trying to decide they were going to have their book set in 2020 and then go, do I really want to deal with all this? Do I put it into the past? So I wrote, the 2015 sections of my book, I wrote them in 2015. And now that feels like historical fiction. Although, because God, how much have we changed in 5 years?
I wrote an essay for the Washington Post about 2 weeks ago. What is the COVID-19 fiction going to look like? And I went to 9/11 to try to see that as the model. when did the first 9/11 books really start arriving in earnest? And it was 2005. 2006 was when they first really started to arrive, because it's so hard to write about history as we're living in it. I mean, I can't imagine writing about COVID-19 right now. Is it a horror novel set in a New York City or Massachusetts or Boston ER? Because there's a lot of Alexis Remnick in an emergency room in this book. But if I were to write this book now and it's set in New York City, it's a very different emergency room. It is just an innermost room of Dante's Inferno 24/7 if the book is set in the spring of 2020. Or is a pandemic novel about COVID-19 about a quarantining dysfunctional family that hates jigsaw puzzles? I just don't know.
Right? I think you always have to deal with this on some level of like, it takes you 3 or 4 years to write a book. I don't know how long it takes you to write a book, but, and by the time you get to the end, cell phones are different,
Yes.
Little things like that, oh God, well, now they could just figure that out with this app that destroys my plot. I guess I have to set it back, right?
There would be no Seinfeld if they had cell phones.
You can
Literally, I love Seinfeld so much, but practically every episode could be solved with a cell phone.
Especially a smartphone.
Yeah.
A cell phone just to begin with, like what movie theater are you at? But the smartphone, where did I park my car?
Yeah.
What's this woman's name? All those things.
Absolutely.
How long does it take you to write a book? You've written a lot of books, so obviously it doesn't take forever, but what's your average? What about this one?
I began the Red Lotus in April 2018, and it was pretty much buttoned up by July of 2019.
Wow. Yeah. And that's like turned in, or is that?
Oh no, yeah, that's final draft. That's
it must be for it to come out now. Yeah. Wow.
That included going to Vietnam to research Vietnam. That included the research with ER doctors and hospital laboratories to understand viruses and bacteria and how you create vaccines.
Yeah. Do you feel like, have they all been that quick for you? Have some of them, did earlier ones take you longer?
Yes. Yeah. As I've gotten older, two things have happened. My daughter grew up and moved away. She's a grown now. She's an actor in New York City. So all of a sudden I've got a lot more time. When my daughter was home, I would start writing at 5 a.m, and then I would stop at 7 a.m. to make her breakfast. And she's an only child, and it's just the most fun in the world for me. And then bring her to school, and then I'd resume work about 8:30 or 9. And then especially because she was a theater kid, then when she was in middle school, I'd pick her up right after school, and we'd go to the voice lessons and the acting lessons and whatever show she was in. And so I was working fewer hours. I was spectacularly happy. And I'm spectacularly happy now, but I'm more productive now because I'm at my desk at 5:30 or 6 in the morning, and I just work nonstop until lunchtime. I go for a bike ride in Vermont, and then I answer emails and do social marketing and do stuff like that until dinner with my lovely bride. And then after dinner, I read. It's a pretty chill life. But I write books. The point of this is I write books faster now because I have more hours a day at my desk than I used to have. I think big change.
But I think for me, and I still have young kids. So that hasn't gotten or it's gotten maybe a little easier, not a lot. But I think also you just get to know your own process. I feel like it's not that it's, each book presents its own challenges, but I at least know how I work. Even if I don't know how each individual book works, I know how my brain works now. And like, I can call myself on my bullshit a little faster, you don't need to try this all from the dog's point of view, Rebecca. That's a bad idea. You're just procrastinating, that kind of thing.
How much of your stuff winds up on the cutting room floor?
See, that's a good question. I'm more likely to go back and rework and rework and rework and rework until it works than to just cut something out. You know, like, I mean, I cut a lot. I usually, for every novel, I have at least one computer file that I call detritus. And it's like cut paragraphs, cut scenes. It's not the like, I don't need this sentence, but the like, oh, this is hard to cut. Maybe I'll use this someday. You never, ever use it again, but it makes things easier, right, to cut them that way. And usually those are 50 to 100 pages long, you know, but of little scraps here and there. I don't give up. I've never given up on a novel. Only a few short stories even that I've fully given up on, rather than just go back and like reimagine something like that. How about you?
Oh God. I mean, well, first, I'm responsible for the single worst first novel ever published, bar none. There is no worse first novel than my first published novel. And the lesson I learned from that is never make that mistake again. So there are actually 3 completed manuscripts where my papers are archived at my alma mater that daughter, who's, you know, my literary executor, so to speak, you know, knows in the letter of directive, under no circumstances let anyone, you know, pull a ghost set of Watchmen on you and ever allow these to be published. Just never, ever let them out. If anyone, for reasons that I can't fathom, ever wants to write about a biography of me and read these, they're welcome to read them, which is why I have not shredded them.
What should have happened to Ghost Set of Watchmen? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe this is my 19 minutes Watergate tape that I should have destroyed long ago.
Okay, so what makes them not work, and what makes you say the first novel was bad? Like, what's not working there that's been working for you in your other books?
Okay, that's two questions, and they're both great. Why does my first published novel? Why is it a train wreck? Why did I not? Why did
not what I said.
Not to allow 3 other books to be published? I'll start with the latter. Those 3 books I don't want published for 3 different reasons. One, it's the first time I tried to write about the Armenian genocide. And when I read the draft of it, I realized all this is a young Armenian American's absolute rage at the injustice of the Armenian genocide and the fact no one even knows about it then. No one even knew about it or acknowledged it. But it had, the characters were wooden and 2-dimensional. It read like an after-school special, except there's brutality and carnage. So I just said, no, I'm not ready to write this book. And gosh, it would be 18 years later, I would write The Sandcastle Girls about the Armenian genocide, and that worked, in my opinion. Another book that exists in my alma mater is a book about, and I've never shared this publicly, a person I went to college with, lived with, who killed himself. And the tectonic effect that had on all of our friendships. And aside from the fact it's not a very good novel, I'm just afraid that it's not a novel that I would want his family ever to read, because it is so filled with what really went on.
Yeah.
And the third novel was a really, really bad ghost story. When a ghost story, works, and you know this well, Rebecca, when a ghost story works, they're really fun. And when they don't work, they're just a bad episode of Dark Shadows or The Twilight Zone. And I was never scared. In this book, if a ghost story doesn't scare you, it's not a very good book.
Damn. And so did it take a long time with those 3 unpublished ones? Did it take a long time to figure out that they weren't working, or was it kind of you knew as you finished up?
I thought the Armenian genocide novel was going to change the world. It was when I read it that I realized, no, you're not ready to write this. This is it's not a novel. It's just anger. It's therapy.
Yeah.
The other novel about the person I went to college with, I had the sense as I was writing it that you can't ever publish this, but the scenes were so visceral and real to me. that I just kept plodding forward. And I kept telling myself the ghost story, like, I was Scott Fitzgerald, which, and I'm going to guess you love Scott Fitzgerald too, because I mean, the epigraph, the great believers comes from a great.
I'm hot and cold on him, but yeah.
Pardon me, you're hot and cold?
Hot and cold, yeah. Love some, hate some. Probably he'd be fun for the first 20 minutes of a party, then you want to leave. And I kind of feel the same way about some of the first stuff.
Yeah. One of the things I loved that Scott Fitzgerald said about writing is that you go down dead ends. And sometimes you've got to go down a lot of dead ends till you find the way through. And when I was writing that first ghost story, I kept assuming I would find my way through, but I just kept finding more dead ends.
Yeah. Well, so wait, you never answered what makes you disown the first novel?
It's apprentice fiction. I mean, okay, here's what happened. So I am working at an ad agency in New York City, and I'm writing fiction from 5 to 7 a.m. in the morning in Brooklyn, where my wife and I live. We're newlyweds. And I'm writing very Scott Fitzgerald-esque short story. Everything is the diamond as big as a Ritz. And I'm getting summarily and consistently rejected by the New Yorker and the Atlantic and the Sewanee Review. And I remember getting rejection slip number 250 and thinking to myself, plan A not working. Time to try plan B. Now, at the time, Cosmopolitan was publishing a lot of fiction. So I rounded up 6 months worth of Cosmopolitans and read them thoroughly. And then I wrote what I thought was the perfect Cosmopolitan short story. So a female supermodel who lives in a spectacular loft in Lower Manhattan. She's married to a fabulously wealthy arbitrage trader. Their marriage is a little bit dicey, so one weekend she goes out to their beach house at Fire Island to see if the marriage can be saved, spends the entire time playing scantily clad beach volleyball. Cosmopolitan bought it. First story ever sold. And suddenly, when it was published, literary agents started approaching me. And they all said the same, do you have a novel? And I didn't. I gave up the immediate gratification of the short story and spent the next year writing a novel. And it was the novel that one of these agents thought was the perfect novel for the moment. This is the era of Bright Lights, Big City, Bret Easton Ellis, Tama Janowitz, Jay McInerney. So I tried to write a Bright Lights, Big City kind of novel, and you can see where, this is going. It's about 4 women from a college very much like Smith, one of whom dies suddenly in a drug deal gone bad in Chelsea. And they're gathering in New York City. It's a terrible mystery, really a terrible, terrible mystery. The characters don't have the depth that a sort of coming of age, grieving for the death of a roommate novel might have made it work. Just nothing about it. But because it was the late 1980s and the era that it was, and because it's New York City and cocaine, publishers bid on it.
Wow. Yeah. Well, and it launched your career. I mean, I don't know. It would be hard. I think most writers have evolved significantly since their first book, right? My first novel is certainly the one that I feel the absolute most distance from. But would you, like, if you had the time machine, would you go back and unpublish it? Or is it just kind of like, it is what it is?
I don't allow my first 3 novels in print. A Killing of the World, Hangman, and Past the Bleachers remain out of print, and I won't allow them back into print because I think they're terrible books. And
oh my God.
If I could go back in time and Past the Bleachers became a lovely Hallmark made-for-TV movie that is so much better than the book. And when a 1995 Hallmark movie is better than the book on which it's based, that says something about the novel.
Oh God. Oh my God. Yeah. Well, I don't know. People love those Hallmark movies a lot.
Okay. you cannot read the novel past the bleachers unless you want to pay a ridiculous amount of money to get it used. But
Yeah.
you can see the movie starring Richard Dean Anderson, MacGyver, Stargate, SG-1 on Amazon Prime.
Oh my God, this was after he was MacGyver?
Yeah, this is the post-MacGyver Richard Dean Anderson.
I never thought to wonder what happened to him.
Grieving development director at a small New England college, very much like Middlebury.
MacGyver at Middlebury is completely something I would read. I understand that's not what you're saying you wrote, but MacGyver at Middlebury is so my jam. That sounds amazing. If you're not going to write that, I'm going to write that. Not really. Oh my God. Well, so how many of your books have been made into film or TV? Do you have the count?
I do. Yeah. It's not like it's an infinite number. I've had 3 books turned into movies. The Flight Attendant will be an HBO Max TV series. They filmed 6.5 of the 8 hours before the pandemic shut down production. It's a great cast. Mikhail Huisman, Kaylee Cuoco, Rosie Perez, Merle Dandridge, T.R. Knight. I was just gobsmacked at. I mean, when the Great Believers becomes a TV series, you're just going to fall in love with just the process and watching it happen.
It's been fun so far. We're at the stage, it's been optioned, and they're getting ready to pitch to the HBO, Hulu, Showtime kind of stations for limited series. And the creative team involved right now kind of blows my mind. In most cases,
Amy Poehler's production company, right? Did I make that up?
Which of course does not mean they're turning it into a comedy. But they did Russian Doll, which was more of a drama that had a big hit this last fall. The person who is presumably writing and directing is someone I'm not allowed to say, but someone who the target demo of The Great Believers would freak out about who this is. And I'm kind of freaking out as I have creative conversations with this person. But that said, I have so many friends who things have gone so far down that road and then they just vanish, poof, Hollywood being Hollywood. And, if it happens, I'm going to be thrilled. And it's in good enough hands that I'm not worried that it would be we're going to give this a happy ending or anything else that they would do to ruin it. I know they do a good job. It's just, do my stars align in exactly that way that it happens? Because I'm sure that things optional.
I'm not going to reveal the ending of The Great Believers, but all of you out there, if you've not read The Great Believers, the ending is Aristotelian perfect. It is everything about the ending of The Great Believers is just perfect.
Thank you. I am an Aristotle geek, so that means a lot. Appreciate it.
It's inevitable and it's surprising. You don't see it coming, and then it comes, and you say it couldn't have ended any other way.
Well, thank you. That's a huge compliment. I appreciate it. It's endings are we never talk about endings. We never, you get stuff workshopped. The endings don't really come up. And then everything hinges on, have you stuck the landing? Did you manage to, yeah. It's like the whole book, I think, is a vehicle to get to this landing point. And I'm always, with my writing students, even with short stories, it's not, it's it's such a greater percentage of the work, the ending. And there's this temptation to sort of back out of the room, hoping that nobody notices.
I have no idea where my books are going when I start them. I have no idea what the ending is ever. I just begin with this vague premise and then depend on my characters to take me by the hand and lead me through the dark of the story.
Which is,
Right.
I was just going to say that I think that's as it should be. And I think the only times that I have thought I knew how something would end, I was delighted then to prove myself wrong. If something ended, if something landed exactly where you thought it was going to land, you probably haven't done a great job of discovery and being open to character and plot as you go, right? It's
That's right.
Yeah.
I
So-
hate to cut in at this point, but we
I
have
was gonna
a
ask,
lot of questions from the audience in the chat. So if it's okay, I think we'll segue to some of those. The first one was from Kathy Jacques, and she asked, why is it called the Red Lotus?
The Red Lotus is called the Red Lotus because that is the national flower of Vietnam, and it is metaphoric for Alexis Remnick, the ER doctor. This is not a spoiler, you get a sense of who she is in that very first page, but there's a beautiful, beautiful Vietnamese saying that you don't have the beauty of the lotus without the mud.
That's a great statement. Same. I should also mention that Rebecca has to leave sharply, right at about a minute till. So just prepare everyone.
Yes, when she disappears, it's not about us. She's teaching a class right after this.
Courage is turning back into a pumpkin at precisely
8 Eastern time, 7:59. But we've got a statement here from Beth Doherty, which I'd like to combine into another question from Kathy Jacques. This was talking about the timing of your publications, Chris, and she was saying it's incredible. She remembered distinctly how Beth did, how she saw you speak in Minnesota just shortly after it was announced that you found out that Midwives was an Oprah pick. And she thinks she was sort of remembering that timing with all the conversation about the strange publication dates of yours. But Kathy follows up with another question saying, did you spend any time in ERs doing research writing the Red Lotus?
I did spend time in ERs researching the Red Lotus. Oh my God, I fell in love with emergency room doctors. If there's an ER doctor watching tonight, thank you. If there's an ER doctor in your life, make sure you go chat with him or her, because, okay, even before we talk about ER doctors in pandemics, ER doctors are amazing. First of all, they have great senses of humor. Ask an ER doctor for the most amazing thing they've ever seen, and they will immediately tell you about getting the Barbie doll stiletto out of the little girl's nose, or they will show you an X-ray of the most inappropriate object somewhere. Oh, the Legos. They will show you, the little boy who managed to eat 64 Legos. Also, they're great multitaskers. I mean, they've got 8 cubicles going with 8 different patients, all presenting different symptoms, and they keep their composure. They're also so empathetic. They always see us at our worst. No one makes an appointment to go to the ER and has on their calendar 10 a.m. ER. When we go there, our breath is toxic. We might be a senior citizen with a diaper that smells like it's been in a Fort Lauderdale dumpster for a week in August. We might have, and these are the 2 most likely reasons you're going to go to an ER in New York City over the weekend: tripped over our dog, or sliced a part of our finger off slicing a bagel. They're just amazing. And now, when we look at what ER doctors endured in March, April, May, and will continue to endure, I just bow before them because, okay, one of the ER doctors I interviewed for this book, she was in a mass shooting. She wasn't shot herself. So after being in a mass shooting, she was literally part of the emergency on-site triage. How do you do that? I just bow before these women and men.
Wow. There was a question from Elisa asking about the unfolding of COVID-19 and all of the people crying about it being a hoax, the blame and the racism and the xenophobia. And she wondered how all of those things in current events have made you reflect on the story that you told in the Red Lotus.
I am always so unnerved by the way the social networks propel fake narratives and ridiculous narratives, and people believe people always want to believe the worst conspiracy theory imaginable. You know, the idea that the White House was pressing that this was a weapon grade virus that the Chinese accidentally allowed out of the lab, or perhaps intentionally allowed out of the lab. I find those kinds of conspiracy theories just so disappointing when people believe them. Obviously, the Red Lotus deals with biological weapons as well as a kind of pathogen. And we all know that an awful lot of countries do have biological weapons or had biological weapons. But COVID-19, well, it's a SARS virus. We know that.
You know what blows my mind is the way, with all conspiracy theories, the people who believe in them believe that they are being deeply skeptical and deeply distrustful of authority. But to believe any one conspiracy theory is to believe in coordinated authority. You know, we can't even, you know, manage to make the, you know, to get planes in and out of airports on time or whatever, but somehow all of these countries secretly came together and decided to do these things. And you're thinking, you think that you're being skeptical. You think that you are rejecting authority and rejecting the power of authority, and you are putting way more stock in the power of authority than authority deserves. Yep. It's such a trip that people are doing to and such belief in power. It's so fascinating.
Brilliant. That's a brilliant point, Rebecca.
Yeah, but there's nothing we can do about it, so can't point it out to
we put the truth out there as much as we can.
Yeah, yeah.
It seems silly to follow that brilliantly perceptive point up with this question, but so goes. From Ilka, what inspired the Vietnam connection, Chris?
It's a great question. It's a great question. Ken Burns' special had recently aired, and I was having lunch with a guy in my little village in Vermont who's older than me. He's a Vietnam veteran. And our conversation gravitated to Ken Burns' special, and so I started asking him questions about his experience as a veteran. He was a helicopter gunner. And the more I pressed, every story he told me ended with one of two things. I never told my wife that, or I never told anyone that. So I began to think there might be an interesting novel in the legacy of the Vietnam War. Not a war novel per se. I mean, you know, Viet Nguyen, Carl Morlantis, Tim O'Brien, they've given us that. But a lot of my books, the plot is literally just a scaffold or a hanger on which to explore character. And so I thought I would love to write about one of the legacy, one of the legacies of the Vietnam War, which is why the Ken Serafian character is so important to me, not simply as an Armenian, but because he's a veteran. Also, excuse to go on a bike tour of Vietnam. Don't underestimate the importance of research.
Clever. Good point. I have a question for both of you in the time that we have left. What are you both working on right now, and how is it working right now?
Rebecca, why don't you go first?
Yeah, gosh. I am working. I got a little side railed. I had was finishing up a feature on the poet Natasha Trethewey for Chicago Magazine. Just got that handed in at like 2 a.m. So hopefully back to work now. But I'm actually working on 2 books. I'm working on the novel that I started about a year ago. Actually, oddly, about the death of someone's roommate. So you're talking about that stuff before. It's a very different situation. And then I'm also writing a middle grade children's novel. It's something that originally I started because I was on the road so much until I suddenly wasn't. And I was feeling guilty and missing my kids. And I decided I would start writing chapters and sending them home to my 9-year-old and my 12-year-old. And now I'm on the hook to finish this thing. But it's also, I taught elementary school in another life for 12 years. And when I did that, actually used to write stories with my class for my class. So this is something, it's an age I've written for before, I just haven't published any of them. So what's nice about it is when I'm really burned out on the one, I have the other. And, you know, at a certain point, it felt like, you know, I was too overwhelmed with stress from the quarantine, but I could work on this children's book. Recently, it's felt more like I need to vent and write my anger into something. I need some catharsis. The children's book feels a little too light to work on. I'm going to work on the adult novel. So nice, theoretically, a good way for me to avoid writer's block too. It's not, do I want to write? It's which book do I need to work on? And then that gets me part of the way there.
I could never do that. I'm so impressed. I could never do 2 books at one time. I think I'm not able to compartmentalize that well.
Only because they're so different, you know, different audience, different age, different tone. There are ways where I'm like, oh, I'm doing the same thing in both books because there's something obviously that I'm trying to work through mentally and I have to stop that. But because they're so vastly different, I could never do 2 adult novels at once. Yeah. What are you working on?
Well, when the book tour was canceled and the pandemic started, I finished my March 2021 novel. It's called Hour of the Witch, 1662 Boston. It's a novel about the first divorce in North America for domestic violence, which, yes, it's Boston, ends in a witch trial.
Oh my God. Presumably for the woman, not for the man.
Presumably for the woman, not for the man. Yeah. Based on a 3-line reference I came across years ago in the records of the Boston Court of Assistants about a woman being granted her divorce because of the cruelty of her husband. And so I started researching Puritan divorce law and just grew obsessed. So I finished that and I'm hard at work on my 2022 novel, which, again, going back to our conversation earlier, Rebecca, I guess it is historical fiction. It's 1964. It's about a Hollywood star who brings her entourage with her on a safari in Africa, and it all goes to hell in a handbasket.
Oh, wow. That sounds great. I mean, it sounds terrible for everyone involved, but as a novel, that sounds great. Oh, that's lovely. That's such a slim section. I don't know if you've read A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan. Such a slim section of people on safari, and it's one of the best parts of that book. And I would make me want the whole book about that. Ah, cool. So you really are writing a book a year. That's the schedule that you're on?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's not necessarily a book every year, but I think I published like 8 or 9 books in the last 11 or 12 years. And again, that coincides with my daughter leaving in 10th grade for boarding school. Prior to that, I did not write, 8 or 9 books in 12 years. It's just...
Okay, you feel a little better. All right. Yeah, my grandmother, my Hungarian grandmother, was a novelist, and I've never been able to read her work because it is only in Hungarian and I speak very little of it, but she wrote 40 books. And
have you ever had any of them translated? You must.
I mean, I'm working on it. We're figuring it out. It's a long saga, but she was well regarded. These weren't, toss off. She wasn't writing like Sweet Valley Twins or anything. These were novels. But 40. And she had 1 kid. She had a nanny, the whole, I don't know what she did. But it's, I look at those sometimes on the shelf and it's just like, oh my God, it's okay. I'll get off Facebook. I'll work. I'll get back to.
This is a much lower bar, but I discovered a couple of years ago that my great grandfather was an Armenian poet when we found some of his published books in Armenian.
Oh my God.
It was such a gift to get some of the poems translated from Armenian into English, including his epic poem about the Hamidian massacres and what turns out to be the death of some of my families. It's extraordinarily fascinating.
We'll have to compare notes then, because this is something, you know, it's just the gravity of the project. For a while it was, I need to learn Hungarian so I can read these. Hungarian is widely regarded to be the most difficult language in the world. So, oh, I just have to master the world's most difficult language and then I'm going to read, you know, literature from the 1930s. This is going to work great. Now it's more, maybe do I find someone to translate them whom I trust? And so we're working on it, but we need to talk more about this.
Okay.
So you're going to bike down and see me, because I am not biking up to see you because my legs won't do it.
Well, we'll do two things. I will bike down to visit you, and you and your family can drive up to visit me.
We'll do that. We'll do that. I'm sad to leave this conversation. This is making me feel like I'm in Northshire Books, and it's making me so happy. And now I have to go. I will love teaching my class too, but I wish I could stick around. I hope everyone else.
Rebecca, thank you so much. It's great to chat with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca.
This was a real pleasure.
Yes, hopefully we will do it in person in Northshire one happy day in the future.
Yes, in the not too distant future, perhaps.
Yes. So Chris, one last quick question before we end, which is from a fellow Armenian wanting the name of your Armenian poet grandfather.
Oh, Nazareth Bedros Bohjalian. Wait, I'm going to leave and come back in a few seconds. This is the encyclopedia of the notable Armenians of Kayseri or Geseria, and it's worth a review. This is my great-grandfather Nazareth Bedros Bohjalian, and these are parts of the longest poem he wrote that he left behind. And I didn't even know any of this because of the way my family was scattered in the Armenian genocide and the Hamidian massacre. So this was a great midlife discovery. Well, midlife if I'm, going to live to be 150.
Please do. And thank you for sharing that with us. That was amazing to see. And I think as we're out of time, kind of the perfect note to end on, thinking about how words survive us and carry us far, far into the future. Thank you.
I want to thank the two of you for making this happen. Thank you, Northshire Manchester. Thank you, Northshire Saratoga. And I want to thank all of you readers who joined us tonight on Zoom for celebrating what words and reading and books can mean to the soul. I can't wait till we can do this in person at your amazing stores. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you all of you for being here. We will be having our next event on Thursday at 5 with Amy Meyerson, author of The Imperfects, one of my favorite books of the year, and the authors of Tiny Imperfections, which is a book that I'm in the middle of right now and enjoying immensely. So hopefully I'll see you all on Thursday at 5. Thank you again, Chris, so much, and have a lovely evening, everybody.
Stay safe.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great pleasure. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.